sure what qualitative research is and what it will entail of you. So I will ask you questions. I will stop. I ask that you do not hesitate to send questions to the chat or even stop me to ask me questions about what it is that I'm saying to make sure that we all have an understanding about qualitative research. So by show of hands, could share if you have already started or if you're contemplating, how many of you lean qualitative? Think that you will do a qualitative research study for your thesis or your dissertation, just by show of hands. Let's see. I only see one hand. Okay. Maybe some of you are unsure, and that's okay. Okay, I see more hands. Okay. So this is my opportunity to kind of talk about qualitative research. I'm in mixed company, I see, but I also think that it may be my opportunity to kind of clarify some misconceptions about qualitative research, what it is and what it is not. So, what is qualitative methodology? And I guess that's the question. And feel free to kind of chime in. But for the most part, qualitative research is definitely research from the heart. Okay, it is humanizing research. It is research that relies on participants' observations, participants' experiences, right? You collect observations, interviews, questionnaires, focus groups, right? Our qualitative research is generally non-numerical. You find that there's some qualitative research that can be semi-numerical, but it's generally non-numerical. It happens in natural settings, okay? But qualitative research, I always describe it as research from the heart, right? It's research that you have to not just see and count, right? But you actually have to form relationships in many cases with participants to get them to open up to you about their experiences, their beliefs, and their perspectives, right? So, one of the things about qualitative research that I want you to keep in mind is that qualitative research, unlike a lot of quantitative methodologies, is qualitative research is what it can be what you want it to be. Okay, in terms of flexibility, it is probably the most flexible of the research methodologies. But then again, I'm biased, so we'll talk about that as well. So if I have any quantitative researchers on the line, I welcome any challenges that you actually pose. So I think I have someone monitoring the chat. Please stop me if you see that there's a question to be answered.
Yes, ma'am, I will.
Okay, thank you. So the goals of this session, and we have about 45 minutes, and so it'll be fairly quick, but I also want to provide you lots of opportunities to answer questions. And so I'll make sure that this PowerPoint is available. I'll also make sure that I'm available via email if you have questions after the session. But I want to provide a brief overview of the qualitative methodologies, the more traditional qualitative methodologies. And then if we have time, I'll get into some of the methodologies that are up and coming, newer methodologies that now people are putting a name to it, and doc students are actually using these methodologies and using them successfully to conduct research with minoritized and indigenous communities, right? Another goal is to kind of bust the myths, right, and misconceptions about qualitative methodologies, and to share strategies and answer your questions about which methodology may or may not work for your research questions, because ultimately it's about what exactly you want to know, right? And so your research question, or questions I should say, will definitely inform the methodology that you choose. Okay, you probably should avoid going the other way, choosing a methodology and then choosing research questions. Generally, it's about what is it that you want to know, what is it in your heart that you're going to be committed to actually working on for the next few years, right? and then kind of deciding, okay, these are my questions. This is the methodology that best suits my research question, right? So here's a poster that I generally share with the students who enroll in my qualitative methodology course, right? Because this is just a quick and dirty of what quantitative methodology is, or the characteristics of quantitative methodology, the characteristics of a mixed methods, and the characteristics, excuse me, I'm getting tongue-tied, of a qualitative methodology, right? The degree of predetermined, whether or not it's predetermined, right? What kind of questions, or the characteristics of your questions, whether it'll be open-ended, both open-ended and closed-ended, right? What type of data um, you should be collecting, right? What your analysis should look like, what your interpretation will probably consist of, and what types of strategies you might employ. Okay, so this is just one of those charts that I always have handy when I'm speaking with doc students about their particular study. So let's start with the myths and misconceptions about qualitative research. Let's see if we can bust some of these, right? So objectivity is the gold standard in research, right? I know. Generally speaking, with quantitative research, this is definitely the case, right? Where it's hands off, and we want to make sure that there is no bias, or that the researcher is not too close to the participants, and that's not necessarily the case with qualitative research. Subjectivity comprises accuracy and trustworthiness to a certain extent. Yes, the data must be trustworthy, or we must trust it, and it must be accurate. Only findings that are generalizable can inform policy and practice. We know that that's definitely a myth, okay? Not all data is generalizable, right? So with qualitative research, you state that up front. But that doesn't mean that it cannot inform policy and practice, right? I have feelings as a parent of an eighth grader of what schooling should be like for eighth graders, right? I'm only one parent. My beliefs are not necessarily, and feelings are not necessarily generalizable, but school administrators can definitely listen to me and maybe a few other parents who have the same issue, and have that inform policy and practice, right? The perspectives of few do not represent many. Not necessarily the case, because if we think about the demographics, even in the United States, right? One would say, okay, let's look at the majority. We know that that's not necessarily always accurate, right? We need to look at the perspectives of the few, okay? Even though it may not represent the majority, we still need to look at the few, okay? Self-reported data are unreliable. So if we think about qualitative research, right, a lot of it will be self-reported. And what makes it unreliable, right? There are ways in qualitative research that we can make sure that this data is reliable. If I self-report my feelings, right, my experiences, for you to tell me that's unreliable, that's an insult, right? And so we kind of, you have a paradigm shift with qualitative research. Another one, qualitative data are useful only when corroborated by numbers. So my friends who do quantitative research and statistical research, they always say, yeah, qualitative data is useful, but I need to be able to corroborate what you're saying with numbers. And no, you don't, right? No, you don't. My feelings and my experiences, or this population's feeling and experiences, doesn't necessarily have to be corroborated by numbers. Administrators and decision makers only respond to numbers. In some cases, that is true, right? But how can we change that? How can we change that? We change that by providing rich, thick descriptions of the experiences of people, right? Qualitative data are easy to collect and analyze. Anyone can do it. I know some of you, because I see your name. I believe I'm on a committee or two of some folks who are in here, and you're doing qualitative research, and you know that it's not easy to collect, and it's definitely not easy to analyze, right? And it's not always easy to write, and anyone cannot do it. And so we'll talk about that as well. There are specific skills that you need to have in order to be a qualitative researcher. You need to be willing to hang in there for long periods of time, look at large amounts of non numerical data, and be able to see patterns and themes and make connections and clearly write about what those connections are without putting your beliefs and your words into the mouths of your participants. Oh, here's another one. Interviewing is the only qualitative assessment technique. Yeah, so we come across this a whole lot where everybody wants to interview, and this should not be the case. Yes, it's one of the main qualitative techniques, but not the only. And so we need to make sure we stay away from that. Qualitative methods are too labor intensive and cumbersome to be practical, right? No, practicality is based on the project that you're endeavoring to complete. So that's a very general statement. And too labor intensive, I think there are um, other aspects that you need to consider when we say too labor intensive. If you're wanting to graduate in the next 2 months, yeah, you may not want to select qualitative, or you may not want to um, go about doing a qualitative dissertation because you already know that it's going to take a little bit more time to actually write up your findings, right? So we need to definitely think about what it is that we want to do, right, in terms of, or what we want to know and what we can do in the time allotted. So these are some of the myths and misconceptions, right, about qualitative research. What are some other ones, if in the chat, what have you heard about qualitative research that has pretty much turned you off, or has like made you go towards completing a qualitative research project? Maybe a dissertation, thesis, or just an article. Are there any misconceptions?
Someone says it takes more time and it is very detailed.
Yeah, yeah. It takes more time. I would agree. I would agree. And it tends to be very detailed. But I think that making sure that your statistics, right, your analysis, your statistical analysis, the types of quantitative methodology you use, that's very detailed as well, right? It's I think it's more, and this is a good conversation to have. I think sometimes it's more difficult. You can't find anybody to do your qualitative analysis for you. Where I know that there are people out there who will do statistical analysis for individuals. Yeah.
We also have, it takes more time, but someone says you also have to code the data.
Yes, you definitely have to code the data. Definitely takes more time, code the data. There are programs now, software to help with that. So that's a good thing. Okay. Anything else?
Not right. Having to collect the data and not getting in touch with your FGD or in-depth interviews.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Having to go there and not get in touch with you. What is FGD? I know in depth. Okay. All right. FGD. Okay. So one of the, just like with a lot of the quantitative research projects, you have to make sure you have methodological alignment. And I'll say that that is the same whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative research. And I usually like conducting these sessions when I have a qualitative researcher who can also talk to or speak to what I'm talking about to kind of for us to compare. So generally speaking, when I say methodological alignment, I'm talking about the philosophical stance and or assumptions that you come to your project with, right? Like what is knowledge, truth, reality for you and to this project, and how do we find knowledge, truth, and reality? Like what is your and so when you see the term ontology, what is truth, epistemology, and how do we find this truth? So with qualitative research, right, truth is within individuals. So my truth might be different from Erica's truth, might be different from Brianna's truth, it might be different from Nadesia's truth, right? But we know that there could be qualitative researchers believe that there are multiple truths, right? Whereas quantitative researchers and quantitative research in general leads to whenever we're dealing with numbers, it's like 2 plus 2 is 4, right? 2 plus 2 is always 4 all day long. There is only one truth. That's not the same with qualitative research. We believe that there are multiple truths, and our truths may be totally different. They may look totally different. Our realities may be totally different, and they look totally different. And then we have to figure out how we find that reality and how we find truth, right? So when you hear the terms ontology and epistemology and philosophical stance and all this stuff, sorry about the typo. When you hear that, it just means like what do you believe truth to be, right? So a lot of qualitative researchers, they go into qualitative research because they believe that there are multiple truths. Like I'm not the holder of truth, right? Like I have my truth and other people have their truths, right? A theoretical framework for qualitative research, generally speaking, you will have a theoretical framework, but not all qualitative methodologies require a theoretical framework, okay? Up front, I'll say that. Grounded theory, for example, and I hope to get to that soon, grounded theory does not require a theoretical framework up front because you are actually creating a theory. It's called grounded theory. The whole idea of your study is to create a theory of what's happening in a situation or what's happening amongst a group of people. So we'll talk about that. So yes, the alignment, you have your philosophical stance, your theoretical framework, research questions if you're doing a qualitative research, and almost like very few cases, if any, will you not have open-ended questions. It's all about the open-ended questions. It's all about addressing the gap in the literature, right? So generally speaking, it's the so what. I always ask my students, like, if I'm on your committee, it's like, so what? What's the gap that you're addressing in the literature? And what are your research questions? And I need your research questions to be questions that you can actually answer, right? So they need to align. And then what are your data collection methods, right? And you know that if you look at your research questions, it'll be able to tell you your data collection method. And then, I'm sorry, somebody's at my door. I don't know why. And then you have your data analysis. What is your actual method of analysis, right? Are you doing critical discourse analysis? Are you doing, visual analysis or conversation analysis? What is it that you are actually going to be working on? Could you hold for a minute? I'm so sorry. Give me 1 second. Okay. All right, so for the data planning matrix, I generally use a data planning matrix to make sure that there is methodological alignment, okay? So one of the things that I would normally have my doc students do, and if you are a doc student and you need this particular document, I'd be more than happy to share it, but it's a data planning matrix for the proposed study. And generally speaking, I have doc students fill in this document. What do I want to know? What do I need to know? Why do I need to know this? What kind of data will answer this question? And how will I analyze this data? And who will I ask, right? Who will I ask? Who will be my participants? And all of that has to be aligned. So it needs to make sense. So this is one that I completed, and this was for my dissertation lots of years ago. There's so much that I would do differently, but just for you to take a look at this. What do I need to know? Here are my research questions. Why do I need to know this? What kind of data will answer this question? Right? So I have interviews, photographs, right? Discord, different types of analysis, different types of participants. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about the 5 different approaches, right? There are 5 different approaches, right? However, that I talk about today, but there's a common process to all of these approaches, right? To all of these approaches, you have a research problem, research questions, data collections process, data analysis process, and then there's a research report, right? So we're going to first start with narrative research. How many of you have heard of narrative research or narrative inquiry? And what do you think that is? What does it sound like it might be?
That is on a focused topic.
Okay. It's on a focused topic. Okay.
When I think of narrative research, I think of like case study type research to a certain extent.
Okay. So case study, narrative. Okay. Case study, kind of. You're getting closer. What is a narrative?
I guess I would say it involves, I'm sorry, I'm outside, it's a beautiful day. I guess I would say it involves addressing a common theme amidst people's experience and like listening to their stories or identities and finding a productive narrative to put down.
Yes, absolutely. So you said it, stories. So you're telling people stories, right? That's the interesting thing about narrative research is that you're actually telling the stories of people. You're talking about their phenomena. It's considered a phenomenon or a method, but it's basically making sure you tell their stories. And from their stories, you're getting the answers to your research questions, right? So generally speaking, it's chronologically connected. There are stages, right? Generally speaking, it's a postmodern orientation where it happens in many different ways. So some people start telling their stories from or from what's happening now when they go back, right? And so they tell their stories from, when they are young up to when they are older. And narrative research is supported by many different types of, I guess, fields of study, okay? But generally speaking, and I'll tell you some of the difference between narrative research and case study when I start to talk about case study. Okay, so sociology, psychology, human development, postmodern orientation, all of these support a narrative research, right? So generally speaking, you can collect stories, and this may be collaborative. You can have individuals tell their individual stories, or you can bring people together so that they can tell their stories and figure out how their stories feed off of one another, like a family, right? If you have a family, then they can tell stories all together, right? They can tell individual experiences and talk about their identities. You can, with narrative research, you collect different types of data, right? You can have them keep a journal based on questions that you might pose. You can also have visual data where they provide pictures, right? And from those pictures, you ask them to tell the story of what's in the image. And again, the chronology of the story need not be the participant sequence. You can actually rearrange later when you start to tell their narratives, right? It can be analyzed thematically, right? So once they have told their stories, you can actually code their stories for themes. What are some of the themes that come out of each of the stories, right? It can be told as a dialogue, or it could be analyzed structurally, however you choose to analyze it, right? You can also look for turning points. And when I say turning points, I'm talking about tensions and or interruptions, right? So if you're focused on trauma, right? What are some traumatic issues that they kind of discuss in these particular stories, right? You can code for places, people and or situations. So if you think about narrative research, there's so much that you can do with it. Biographical study, autoethnography, life histories, right? Testimonials. Now that's really hot right now. And like a lot of the Latino Hispanic researchers are focusing on testimonials, right? During certain places and spaces and time, they're looking at the experiences of this particular group of people, right? So narrative research, and again, autoethnography, at one point, autoethnographies used to not be cool. Now people are actually conducting autoethnographies and doing and talking about their life story depending on what their life story is about. For example, if you were a child and you spent your entire time in foster care, right? You could do an autoethnography as your dissertation about your experiences in the foster care system, right? Or you can have a collective, right, ethnography about a group of people who live life in the foster care system. So you can be very, very creative. Narrative research does have some challenges, right? You have to clearly understand the participant's life context. You have to look for the figure under the carpet, like, okay, what's exciting and how does that relate to your research question, right? And you have to bracket yourself and reflect on your personal and political backgrounds and see how that influences the telling of this person's story. Because remember, you have to tell their story, right? And then you have to consider who owns the story. So our goal is to make sure that the people still own their story. And there are ways that we do this. Again, that's more methodological, where we actually, once we have written up their stories, we give it to them and say, do you approve of this story that we're about to tell, right? So you probably see now when people do these biographies on TV, they're like, oh, on certain people, the people are like, that's not my story. I don't know where they got that story from, right? We want to make sure that doesn't happen with narrative research. So we make sure that we run it by the individuals, our participants, so they can agree that that is actually their story. So here are some narrative inquiry research questions. What were first-time voters' experiences engaging in the 2020 presidential election? You can actually get their stories. How do or did international students experience the COVID-19 pandemic? In this case, you can actually collect stories. And from that, you can come up with the experiences of the individuals. Does this make sense? Are there any questions? And keep in mind that narrative inquiry, these questions are not just for narrative inquiry. These two research questions can fit other types of paradigms as well. I'm sorry, did I hear someone about to say something?
Yeah, there's no questions, but FGD is focus group discussion.
Yes, focus group discussions, absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Phenomenology. So let's talk about phenomenology. So phenomenology, some of the research questions that you have with narrative research, you can also use for phenomenology. And so phenomenology describes a lived experience, right? And what we do is we take sometimes the stories, the interviews that we have from an individual, and we reduce it to the phenomenon of this particular thing, right? We know this is the object of a human experience, and we want to focus on what is experienced and how it is experienced, right? Phenomenology does have a strong philosophical component, and there are different types of phenomenology. Definitely different types of phenomenology. So the experiences are very much in the conscious when we're talking about phenomenology. We're focused with phenomenology on a single concept or a single idea, right? Generally speaking, there's a heterogeneous group of participants, but they all have that one thing in common, the phenomenon that you're looking at, right? The researcher definitely brackets themselves. And when I say bracket, they think about their experiences to make sure that they're not biased when they're asking the questions to the participants. Typically, interviews for this particular type of methodology. And then for the data analysis, you have broad statements of what it means to experience something, like what it means to lose a pregnancy, or what it means to survive COVID-19, right? And then you broaden that down to a phenomenon, the essence of what it means, or the essence of a particular experience. So there are some definite challenges, right? You have to be careful with selecting your participants. They have to agree that they have experienced a phenomenon, right? Bracketing our personal experiences can always be tough. And that's why it's good to have outside readers to come in and read your work to make sure you're definitely not being biased and you're definitely not kind of putting your experiences on your participants, right? So you have to decide how you do that, right? So some research questions that I have seen in phenomenology research projects are the following. What is the experience of converting from Christianity to Islam, right? So that's a lived experience. What is that experience like? What is the lived experience of nurses who worked in the emergency room during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So the whole idea for a phenomenology study is to kind of talk about the essence of that experience. So you need to name what that experience looks like, okay? And what are the characteristics of that experience? And in those characteristics, you're going to give examples from participants' lives and say, the lived experiences of people who did this, this phenomenon looks like this, and then you describe it, right? So the one thing about phenomenology is that you're reducing all of your participants' experiences into this one kind of phenomenon, and you're describing that phenomenon, right? So all of the nurses, even though there may be some differences, you're looking at the commonalities of the phenomenon, right? Of those who worked in the emergency room during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is what you're describing. So that's phenomenology. Any questions, comments, thoughts about that? Okay. I know time is going. So now grounded theory, because I know that you guys probably have heard of case studies, so I'm glad we're kind of hitting on this one first. Grounded theory is to basically generate or discover a theory with some kind, and you have some kind of diagram to show what the theory that you have come up with looks like. I absolutely love grounded theory, but this is one of the qualitative methodologies that very few students ever choose. I think I might have had one or two students to choose this particular qualitative methodology where they actually generate or discover some kind of theory. I actually think it's fairly, I'm not going to say easy, but I think it's interesting because you can come up with what you basically are writing your book, right? This is what this thing is. This is how it operates, right? So it's generally highly structured, but you're providing a theoretical explanation for some thing or some phenomenon. It could also be a phenomenon, right? There are different types of grounded theory. Charmez came up with constructivist grounded theory, where you're actually constructing and sometimes co-constructing with your participants, right? The focus is on process or action, how something happens, right? There's a lot of memoing of ideas during the data collection and analysis process. So you have a journal and you're notebooking it. The data collection method primarily interviews, but you can also do observations. That observations are using grounded theory a lot, but mainly we see a lot of interviews. You have to set aside your pre-existing theoretical ideas, right? So I'm a big critical race theory. That's me. I do feminism a whole lot, Black feminism specifically. So you have to set aside pre-existing theoretical ideas, because if you're coming up with a new kind of grounded theory, you don't want to be clouded by what's already out there, right? And you have to allow your theory to emerge. And so there are specific steps, and Corbin and Strauss to kind of guide you through actually conducting a grounded theory study. One of the other challenges is that, generally speaking, for grounded theory, you need more participants than you normally would need for other types of qualitative research, right? Because you have to make sure that you're collecting data in order to prove that something is happening and this is actually a theory. You have to continue to collect that data until you no longer see these patterns, right? And so your theory must be very strong, and it must have specific components, and you must be able to produce some type of diagram and some type of visual of what your theory is, right? And that theory must match, or that diagram must match the data from your study, right? Sharmaz provides a little bit more flexibility to the grounded theory that that she produces, or that she subscribes to, right? So these are a couple of grounded theory questions, right? How and why do high schoolers start smoking, right? So you're theorizing, how and why do they start smoking, right? How do minority faculty navigate the tenure and promotion process at a predominantly white institution, right? So for these two studies, the researchers actually came up with an actual theory of what that looks like, and there's an actual diagram of the how and the why. Okay, so this can be fun if you're into kind of making charts and making diagrams to come up with a grounded theory study. And the thing about grounded theory as well is, I know that for those of us who don't necessarily like lit review, the lit review for grounded theory is usually a little bit different, right? Usually doesn't depend on a lot of the theory, focusing on theory, because you're creating your own theory. So why base your study on a theory when you are creating a theory? Okay, so I know that we're at 11:40. Do I have enough time to go through a few more of these before I open up for questions? Yes?
Yes, we probably got maybe 5 or 7 more minutes.
No problem. No problem. So ethnography. So I would discourage, and I want to mention this to you all because sometimes when you're looking at all these qualitative research methods and you don't know which one to choose, you just choose one. Do not choose ethnography. Save ethnography if you're a qualitative researcher for when you get your job out, there, and you can get a grant and you can go study in South Africa or some other place. Ethnography, usually that's only done very well when you have long periods of time to spend with your participants, okay? And when I say long periods of time, I'm talking like a year, 2 years, like kind of immersing yourself in that particular culture, right? Because you want to understand the culture. You want to be able to look for patterns. You have to do extensive field work with interviews, observations, artifacts. There's no way you can really do that, okay? This is a dissertation, so I usually kind of dissuade students from doing an ethnography unless they have some grant where they have to be in school for the next 2 years anyway, okay? So I'm going to skip a couple of these. Case study, I think because I want to get to one of the final slides. Case study, probably one of the most used qualitative methodologies where we can actually look at individual cases or collective cases. I did a case study for my dissertation research, and I only had four participants, okay? So you don't need a whole lot of participants to do a case study. You need to have very solid questions. You need to make sure that your lit review is solid. You need to make sure that your cases are bounded, right? And we know what the case is. Is the case the individual student? Is the case a school? Is the case a school district? Is the case, right? So making sure that you understand that. making sure that generally speaking, you're going to have a case description and you're going to have themes. Um, Sometimes there's a single case, and you can have single cases, and that's fine, right? I know that people will dissuade you. I know that your sometimes committees will dissuade you. Sometimes your chair will dissuade you. Listen to your chair, but at the same time, make sure that you can kind of show examples of where these type studies have been done and have been done well, if this is where you're leaning towards. Okay. And so I'm going to skip through some of this because you're going to get this PowerPoint, but I want to make sure that we have a discussion about making sure your methodological shoe fit, right? Sometimes students force this, and you should not force it, right? If your research question is not a qualitative research question, but you're afraid of statistics or you're afraid of doing a quantitative study, it's not going to work. If you really have a qualitative question, but you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to stay here that long to do qualitative research. You kind of have to figure it out. Mixed methods, that's also an option, right? But again, understand that in most cases, mixed methods is like twice the work, twice the types of analysis. You have to do both the qualitative analysis and the quantitative analysis. And so I always ask students, and you should ask yourself, does the methodological shoe fit? If it fits, you wear it. If not, you got to push it to the side and figure out which shoe fits. Okay. Some of the books on my shelf, I usually like to just share this. And as a qualitative researcher, I think it's important to have these texts. I have some of the classics like Cresswell. If you're a qualitative researcher, make sure you definitely have, Cresswell is more introductory, but Dr. Kakali Bhattacharya, she actually has an amazing fundamental qualitative research text that I highly recommend, okay? Black Feminism and Qualitative Inquiry. If you're into Black feminism and that's your thing, definitely pick up Venus Evans Winter's book. If you're into intersectionality, there's so much out there. If you are doing any kind of work on decolonizing methodologies or humanizing research, there are texts out there to help you. If you're interested in doing research on social media, there are now texts out there to help you with that. In each of the qualitative methodology, there are actual texts, right? So there's one for phenomenology, one for narrative, or not one, but there's a whole line of texts for conducting grounded theory, ethnographic research. So your resources are out there, they're abundant. You have not only the text, but you have resources at Tennessee State University, at the Writing Hub, where if you just want to sign up to come and talk about your project and what you think that you want to do, we are more than welcoming of that, just to have conversations of what might fit. And so I will open up the floor for any final questions, comments, or thoughts that you have regarding qualitative research, myths, misconceptions, or your thoughts in general.
This was very informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I feel like I rushed it because I had so much to cover and so little time, and then my dog started barking. But yeah, if you all have any questions about qualitative research, like I said, I'm always here. My email address is below, and I ask that you not shy away from qualitative research, or even if you feel like your writing skills are not the strongest. Because one of the things that I've realized is that in order to become a good writer, you have to practice writing. And as long as you're not super rushed, I think there's a place for you with qualitative research. We can help you. That is what we're here for, right? And so just know that you have that support.
So I just want to jump in and say thank you to Dr. Bryan. And what she didn't say is, as she talked about the Writing Hub, that she has been probably for the last 4 years, one of the writing facilitators in the Writing Hub. So if you do sign up for a session through the Writing Hub, she will be one of the facilitators that you can choose from to get the one-on-one assistance with your writing. Um, I also want to put a plug in, and unfortunately, we were not able to get someone to speak on the opposed side, as Dr. Bryan said, of quantitative, which is what I am, because we like to do both in tandem, recognizing, of course, that we probably would have students on the Zoom that are quantitative, but know that, unfortunately, the person was not able to come and present to us. But I'll also say to that also don't narrow yourself down to one. The story I tell is, as an engineer, before I got my doctorate, I was very quantitative in nature. And then when I went to get my doctorate, I learned and start dib-dabbing a little in qualitative writing. And so it's not a bad idea to know both. You may preference one over the other, but it's not a bad idea. And the reason I say that is that, now in your graduate walk, as well as when you graduate, when you start collaborating with individuals, that actually positions you to be able to negotiate collaborations better. Even though, like, I go in and I tell people I'm a quantitative methodologist, but I know qualitative. Now, I may not know it as well as Dr. Bryan, of course, would never say that because she's a guru of that, especially at TSU. But I can hold my own. So I think, become a more proficient and prolific writer is to know how to do both, at least have an understanding of both, even though one may be preference, whether that preference be your own individual personal preference or preference based on your discipline, right? I know those of you that are on the call, they're in the hard science, you're more numbers, you're more of a matter of fact, as Dr. Bryan has said, but it does not negate, in qualitative, because one day you may want to, partner or share with someone or write an article with someone. Well, knowing how to do, or at least understand, can help you in that partnership. So I just want to make sure, I guess I'm not apologizing, but just, saying that we unfortunately don't have a quantitative presentation, but those of you all who feel you are situated in that type of methodology, don't be closed-minded to qualitative writing. And, over the years, qualitative has risen up. It's not as high as my quantitative, but certainly the appreciation for that type of work has increased even in my own catalog of work. So I just wanted to put that plug out there as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Tyler. I mean, you are absolutely amazing because just having conversations with you about the quantitative and the qualitative, I'm like, man, she's doing both. That's what I aspire to do. I'm trying to get there. So thank you very much for having me. Dana Jennings had a question in the chat.
Yeah.
A question that I wanted to make sure that I answer before we ended. Do you recommend qualitative software? I didn't get to talk about qualitative software. So Dr. Tyler may be able to help out with this. So listen, her question was, do you recommend in vivo and have you used Deduce?
Okay.
I personally recommend Deduce. Okay, so let me tell you why. But I'm not saying I think in vivo is great. I've used in vivo. I think Deduce, I like Deduce because Deduce you can pay for monthly. You don't have to have a yearly subscription. It's a lot more economical. And even if I decide to let my subscription for Deduce lapse, then I can pick up a year from now and say, hey, can I have my subscription back and I still have my data that's in Deduce, right? Deduce also allows for you to have collaborators. And I'm sure in vivo does as well. I don't know, like, I use Deduce. I like Deduce. I use Deduce. However, I think in vivo would be more situated for an institutional license. And I say that now to say that TSU, I don't know the situation. Maybe Dr. Tyler knows it. They have all types of quantitative software. This is where I get a little testy. They have SPSS, and I think there's another one. I don't think we have an institutional license for any of the qualitative software.
We do not. Unfortunately, that's one thing I am advocating for. Let me say that I am advocating for that. But we do not have, from a university standpoint, a global university license like we have in SPSS. And just to add to that, I am a in vivo, and I laughed when I said that because I use in vivo. I have, so if anybody needs to use in vivo, I have no problem sharing mine because I have a pro license that has some additional seats to it. But it wasn't until I started researching, and let me just say, Dr. Bryan and I have published together, is when I was introduced to Deduce. So just as I was trying to bring her into the world of in vivo, she was pulling me into the world of Deduce. They both have their advantages. I do think that in vivo is a little more robust, but at the end of the day, and to your point, Dr. Bryan, they in vivo does have a collaboration arm component for it, for to be able to collaborate. I think from a student standpoint, though, this is one thing I appreciate her introducing me to Deduce. From a graduate student standpoint, it is more economical, right? In terms of quote unquote broke graduate students, because in vivo is not cheap. I think the cheapest, and that's the bare bottom minimum for Deduce, is like $1,000. I mean, it's expensive, right? Of course, mine was a little higher because I got the pro and I got the transcription and I got collaborator. I added stuff to mine, so mine was very, very expensive. But Deduce is very economical. I see Dr. Bryan has put in Deduce is $10 a month. So that's very economical for students, right? As it relates to, being able to afford what you can afford to get the job done. Whereas, like I said, in vivo, in vivo, it's a little more expensive. So, yeah. But I had to put my plug in for that because, that's my preference.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. I've been trying to get Deduce or in vivo or something for years. And in terms of interviews, when you decide to transcribe interviews, I paid to have something transcribed. If you can use Zoom does a decent job with transcriptions. I don't know if anybody realizes that, but I recently just started using Zoom a whole lot more than Revit.
I just recently did some. Now, what I'm finding, first of all, university does have a license for Zoom, okay? I know it's for employees. I'm almost certain it's for students as well. But the caveat to that, and I learned this the hard way, after I'd already recorded 2, you can only transcribe if you save to the cloud. If you are doing a Zoom and you are recording, if you say, I want to save to my computer, the transcription element does not work. So when it pops up and asks you, when you begin an interview, it asks you, do you want to save to the cloud, save to your computer? You need to say save to the cloud. Now, even when I went back and did that for the follow-on interviews that me and my GAs were doing, my RAs were doing, for me, it wasn't that well. We still had to go in and do a lot of manipulation with it, but it was good. I mean, it helped. And some of it could have been the way people were speaking. They may have been speaking too fast or something like that, but it was okay. I think, again, it's another way of doing it more economical. That is a great way, but just one caveat is that you have to save to the cloud, and then yes, you can use the Zoom transcriptions to transcribe.
I was a broke grad student, so I'm doing free 99 if I can, and kind of working it through. But if you have a little bit of change, we have other options as well.
Yes.
So thank you all. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via email. I try to be very responsive, and I wish you nothing but the very best on this journey. Through your dissertation, your thesis. I know you're going to all be amazing. Thank you, Dr. Tyler.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryan. So we have about 3 minutes. We will break for lunch. We ask that you come back at 12:45 for when Dr. Mosley, or 1 o'clock, I'm sorry. Stephanie, remind me, is it 1 o'clock or 12:45, please?
Dr. Mosley's session starts at 1 o'clock, but we get back at 12:45.
Okay, so you have a little bit of wiggle room, but if we definitely could be back by 1 to welcome her back into the last 2 sessions, she will carry the last 2 sessions. So we ask that you go out and get some lunch, take a break, stretch, tell your friends about this. You can share the link to the Zoom. Again, the morning sessions were very engaging, and nothing short of that will be for the second session with Dr. Mosley. So again, we will break on time, actually giving you back 3 minutes toward your lunch, 2 minutes now. And we will see you back no later than 1, but 12:45, no later than 1. Thank you again, Dr. Bryan, always.
Thank you.